Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kathy Purdy. I am a marketing manager with Schoeneck King. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's paid sick leave webinar with Carrie Langen and Teresa Rusnak. Two quick housekeeping items before we get started. Please submit your questions through the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and Carrie and Teresa will do the best they can to get to those throughout the presentation. Once the webinar has completed, if you would take a moment to complete the brief survey, we would greatly appreciate that. So to get today's program started, I'm going to hand it over to Teresa.
All right, thank you, Kathy, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Carrie and I are back to talk about paid sick leave one more time, and I'm sure not for the last time as we continue to wait for more information from New York State. And as these things develop, of course, we'll try to keep you updated. So this afternoon, we're going to be doing a half hour on answering your questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted their questions ahead of time. We are always happy to receive those. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can today. Certainly, if we don't get to your questions, you're welcome to ask Carrie or I those afterwards. So I'm going to start off by asking Carrie our first question, and we're just going to go back and forth. So Carrie, will we receive regulations or proposed regulations from New York State on paid sick leave?
So that's the million-dollar question, right? I think we will. We've heard sort of informally that we should be receiving regulations. I don't know when that will be. And even if we do receive regulations, there will be a notice and comment period. So, you know, I doubt that regulations will be final before January 1, but we should receive some additional guidance, you know, hopefully, you know, any day now. Teresa, I'm going to ask you the second question. Do employers have to distribute policies, PSL policies to employees?
Yeah, so this is a question that is a little bit nuanced. So the statute itself doesn't have a policy requirement, but the guidance does say that if you're going to impose any type of limitations, like how much paid sick leave people can use, if you're going to do 4-hour increment uses or anything like that, you're going to want to have a paid sick leave policy. And then just in general, you're going to want to have a paid sick leave policy because it's going to interact with all of your other benefits. You're going to want employees to know that they can take the leave. So yeah, I would say, generally speaking, have a paid sick leave policy ready to distribute to your employees either on or before January 1st. And then Carrie, what about posting? Does an employer have a posting requirement about paid sick leave in the workplace?
So there's no poster obligation. And, you know, I think the only thing I would say about that is the guidance does say that if you don't have a policy, you can explain your, you know, rules and limitations in a posting and post it somewhere. You know, generally speaking, though, I agree with Teresa. I think you should just have a policy. You already have one anyway on you know, your PTO, vacation, sick, personal. So I think it makes the most sense to put this information into a policy in your handbook. No official posting requirement.
All right, hold on. I'm getting this.
It's okay. We're just waiting for the next. Okay, here we go. So Teresa, how does an employer count its employees for purposes of determining how much PSL it has to offer?
So an employer, the number of employees is still something that we don't really know. We know if you have over 100 employees, you have to offer 56 hours. If you have under, it's got to be 40. You know, what constitutes 100 employees or under 100 employees is still up in the air. This is something that we're hoping the regulations are going to address, because right now we don't know. Do you have to count only your full-time? Do you have to count everyone you've given a W-2 to for what time period? Do you have to count out-of-state employees? You know, we just don't know that yet, although that is something I'll note. We do expect the regulations to be able to clarify that prior to January 1. And then Carrie, are per diem employees covered by paid sick leave? And what if they choose their own schedules? How does that work?
Yeah, and just really quick before I answer that, Teresa, you reminded me of something I wanted to say with the regulations. So we do expect there to be regulations. We have heard, though, that the information is going to be limited. So, you know, how to count employees, we've heard would be covered. Notice obligations would be covered, but it is supposedly limited guidance for what that's worth. So in terms of per diem employees, yes, they are covered by paid sick leave. even though, they work sporadic schedules, even if they choose their own schedules. You can choose to either front load the time, or you can have them accrue it. And for per diem, sometimes it makes sense to have it accrue because they're not working, a lot of hours and their hours are sporadic. But yes, they are covered and they have to technically accrue the time at 1 hour for every 30 worked. Teresa, does leave begin to accrue after a break in employment?
Yes, it does. And now it depends, obviously, what the break in employment is. Generally, if someone is terminated and then rehired several years later, you don't have to continue their leave accruals from their first employment with you. But the guidance does provide, particularly if you have seasonal employees or other employees that have regular breaks in employment, you would continue their paid sick leave accruals from the first employment to the second employment. So please, that one's probably going to be a little bit more nuanced and a little trickier. So if you are an employer with regular gaps in your employment for your employees, we encourage you to reach out to counsel on the parameters of that. And then Carrie, must an employer count paid time off towards an employee's paid sick leave accrual?
So the answer to this one is no. You only have to count actual hours worked. So if an employee is using their paid sick leave or some other type of paid time off, that's not time worked. So it doesn't count toward their accrual of 1 hour for every 30. Teresa, can an employer front load for full-time employees and accrue for part-time employees?
Yes. There's nothing in the statute that says you have to front load for everybody or accrue for everybody. If you want to front load for some and accrue for others, that's fine. I've seen a number of employers splitting that up on the full-time, part-time lines, as this question suggests. I've also seen employers split it up between exempt and non-exempt, where the where the exempt employees get front-loaded and the non-exempt employees accrue. I've also seen it where full-time and part-time are front-loaded, and then anything that's per diem or seasonal accrues. You can split it up any way you want, as long as you don't split it up, along discriminatory lines where you're only giving certain classes of employees more leave than others, and that's based on a protected category. But otherwise, yes, you can. And Carrie, I know this is a question we get a lot about. What does the 4-hour mandatory increment rule mean? And specifically, the question we get is, does this mean that an employee can't take more than 4 hours of paid sick leave at a time?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's written in kind of a funny way, but what it means is that you as an employer can't make an employee take more than 4 hours at a time. So you can't say, employee, you have to take sick leave in daily increments. That's not going to be okay. 4 hour is the lowest possible increment. That doesn't mean you can't have a policy that says, we allow you to take it in 1 hour increments. In fact, that's actually pretty common. So you can allow less than 4, but you just can't mandate that they take it in greater than 4 hour increments. Okay. Teresa, can an employer cap carryover at 40 or 56? This is one that we've been getting nonstop. And it's because it's kind of really confusing, unnecessarily so, I think. But Teresa, do you want to answer that question?
I will. And then it ties in nicely with the one that's going to be next for you about front loading. So, so while the guidance should say that you can cap carryover at 40 or 56 hours because you're allowed to cap use at 40 or 56 hours and you're allowed to cap accrual at 40 or 56 hours, the guidance does not say that. It just says any unused available paid sick leave needs to be able to be carried over. Now, will we get more information on that? Hopefully. If not, an employer runs a risk by capping carryover at all. But I would imagine the risk would be less if you're capping it at the maximum use increment of 40 or 56 hours. But again, that's really something that we don't have good information on yet. And one of the reasons why that's so confusing is because of what Carrie's about to speak to. Under the New York City law, you don't have to allow carryover at all when the leave is front loaded. So Carrie, is that the case for New York State paid sick leave?
Yeah, unfortunately not. So, right now there's nothing in the statute or the guidance that says that you don't need to carry over even though you're front loading the time. And it's unfortunate, right? Because if you can cap use at 40 or 56 hours And if you're front loading the entire 40 or 56 hours on January 1st of each year, let's say, there's no point in carrying over. And so I know it's frustrating a lot of you out there that have to try to figure out how to draft these policies with sort of an unlimited carryover. But you can cap use. There is some contradictory language in the guidance in a question, and I think Teresa may have talked about this on the last webinar that we had. There's a question about part-time employees and front loading for part-time employees in the guidance. And there's one sentence in there that says something like, if you front load less than 40 hours, you have to make sure you're carrying over their time, which sort of implies, well, if you front load 40 or more hours or 56 or more hours, you don't have to carry it over. But the guidance doesn't say that. And in fact, in another question, it says, yes, you have to carry over time from year to year, even though we realize it results in potentially more time in the bank that an employee can ever use. So, I think we have to be careful. Teresa and I discovered that FAQ on part-time employees was largely taken from the New York City question and answer, frequently asked questions on the New York City paid sick leave law. They copied it almost verbatim. So I think it was a mistake. I don't know, but hopefully we'll get some guidance on this. I would just, continue to hang in there if you can. Teresa, how far in advance can an employer require notice?
That's a good question. So the guidance, the only thing the guidance says on notice, and the statute is silent on it entirely, the only thing the guidance says on notice is that an employer can require prior notice. I was hopeful that it would say something like 30 days or as soon as reasonably foreseeable, but it didn't. So really, the only limitation or parameter you can put on notice is that notice needs to be prior to the use of the paid sick leave, which leads us nicely into the next question, Carrie. If an employee fails to provide notice, so say they don't give you any notice, they just no call, no show, or they tell you after they leave, can the employee be disciplined or not granted the ability to apply the leave to the absence if they don't give any notice?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and we got this one a couple times. Obviously the statute doesn't say anything about this, and there's nothing in the guidance, but the law does say that employees are required to provide advance notice. So if an employee provides no notice or is a no call, no show, I think you can discipline for that. And you can, say you're not allowed to use your paid sick leave, absent extenuating circumstances, right? I mean, if somebody, goes to the hospital and they can't call, right? And there's some type of extenuating circumstances. But if the employee doesn't have a good excuse for not providing any notice at all, I think then we can say you're not allowed to use your paid sick leave and the absence becomes unexcused and subject to your attendance policy. Teresa, do employees primarily employed out of state accrue paid sick leave if they work in New York?
Yes, they do. So the guidance does talk a little bit about paid sick leave for out-of-state employees. And it says, if you are a primarily out-of-state employee, and if you work for even a primarily out-of-state employer, say the employer's corporate headquarters are located in Pennsylvania or a different state. If that employee spends time working in New York, they are going to accrue paid sick leave only for the time they actually spend working in New York State. So you would have to track those hours separately, or at least track them and be able to have them accrue leave during those hours that they spend time in New York. I know I'm not going to talk about this in great detail because I know it doesn't apply to all of you, but I've gotten a number of questions in the past couple of days about employees that simply drive through New York, for work, or, if they're truck drivers or just, traveling through the state and it's working time, do they have to accrue paid sick leave? So if you're in that situation, feel free to reach out and I'm happy to discuss that with you because I know that's one that's been coming up a lot recently. But Carrie, in the meantime, does paid sick leave run concurrently with paid family leave?
So it could, right? If the employer agrees and the employee agrees, you can allow an employee to use their paid sick leave to supplement their PFL benefit to get to full pay. So for example, if somebody's out for a reason that qualifies as both paid family leave and they can use their paid sick leave, you could let them use whatever portion of their paid sick leave they need to use, if it's an hour, 2 hours, to supplement their $840 PFL benefit. But again, it has to be, mutually agreed upon. It's not something that we can force on an employee. Teresa, does the amount of leave used and available need to be disclosed on an employee's pay stub? And we've been getting this question a lot. I've seen it at least 3 or 4 times. Teresa's seen it. So we wanted to clear up some of the confusion around this.
Yeah, so I think there's confusion around this for 2 reasons. One, because under New York State paid sick leave, you have to keep track of an employee's hours used or available for paid sick leave purposes. You know, if you remember, and I know we've talked about this on other webinars, employers do have an obligation to make that information available to employees within 3 days of an employee's oral or written request for the same. So if someone asks you, how much sick leave did I use this year and how much do I have available, within 3 days, you need to be able to get them that answer. The record keeping requirement also imposes a 6-year time period where you have to keep records of how much sick leave has been accrued or granted and how much has been used. So I think that can cause some confusion, but there's nothing in the law that actually, or guidance that says that information needs to be included with each paycheck. It can be, there's nothing to prohibit you from doing that, but it doesn't have to be, and it doesn't have to be on the pay stub either. The other source of confusion with this, I think, has come from those of you that have been reading about the New York City law or who have employees in New York City. September 28th, New York City came out with new legislation imposing a pay stub requirement. So the only time there would be a pay stub requirement for you is if you have a New York City employee. Other than that, it's not going to apply for just New York State paid sick leave, as long as you keep track of the records.
Right. Yeah. Keep the records for 6 years, right?
Yes, please keep the records. Carrie, does an employer have to track PTO used for paid sick leave purposes when the policies are combined?
Yeah, so this is, there's a little bit of uncertainty here. But no, I think generally if you have a PTO policy, you're allowed to use it to satisfy your obligations under the paid sick leave law, as long as you're allowing employees to use it for the same reasons under paid sick leave, satisfying the use, accrual, and carryover requirements of paid sick leave. So if your policy is drafted to do that, and if you're referencing paid sick leave and all the reasons why you can use paid sick leave, I think you're fine if you're just tracking it as PTO. You don't have to necessarily track it separately. Teresa, can employees use PTO prior to January 1 when PTO and PSL are combined?
Yeah, and this is an excellent question. It's not one that we have a firm answer to, but basically what would be happening in this situation is an employer would combine PSL with PTO, and they're letting employees use that time even before we hit January 1. So Carrie and I discussed this before we got on the webinar, and we're both inclined to say that because an employer in this scenario would be giving the employees the ability to use the leave even before the state was, it's doubtful that could be problematic to the employer. There is another slightly different school of thought that would suggest that anything used before January 1, 2021 couldn't really be designated as quote unquote paid sick leave. But I think if you are going to give employees the ability to use combined PTO and PSL prior to January 1, 2021, you're probably okay to do that. And then Carrie, our last question, and then we'll take some of the questions submitted by all of you. How does an employer track working hours for purposes of accrual for exempt employees?
Yeah, and I think this is a really good question because we've been getting this quite a bit. So we were hoping that the guidance would say that you can assume that an exempt employee would work a 40-hour work week for purposes of accrual, because we know a lot of you don't, a lot of employers don't track exempt employees' time. So you wouldn't necessarily have records of hours worked for exempt employees. Unfortunately, the guidance did not say that. So, even though other states and New York City says that, I think what we're left with here, unfortunately for now, is that if you have exempt employees and you are going on the traditional accrual model of 1 hour for every 30 worked, then you're going to have to actually have exempt employees track their time, unless we hear otherwise. So, again, we just wanted to clarify that for everybody. There's nothing that says that we can assume that exempt employees work a 40-hour work week for purposes of accrual. Okay, so I'm going to go here to the questions that have been coming in, and we'll try to answer some of these in the time that we have left. So Teresa, there's a question here. Can I pay out rather than carry over? What do you think about that one?
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you on that one than I do. So, payouts, I think, would be permissible if they were voluntary. If you said to the employee, you can choose to carry over or you can pay out, I'd have less problems with it that way. But other than that, the statute does not, and the guidance do not speak to having buyout policies in lieu of carryover. So even if you are going to offer them voluntarily, I would just be very careful and purposeful about that decision, because the text of the statute itself, and the guidance doesn't do anything to dissuade this, is that any unused accrued time needs to be carried over. The guidance does give an option for employees to donate their unused sick leave to other employees, but it doesn't say anything about buyback.
Thanks, Teresa. So here's another one. If an employee travels to another country and is mandated to quarantine when they return, are they eligible for paid sick leave? And I think this is a good question, and I'll answer this one because, people may get confused, but, between paid sick leave and the COVID-19 emergency sick leave that was passed earlier this year. So this paid sick leave is actually for, employees when they're ill. So if somebody is quarantining because they have COVID-19 and they're sick, then they may be eligible for paid sick leave. But if it's related to a mandatory quarantine, then you're looking at the emergency paid sick leave, which is different than what we're talking about here today. Teresa, let's see, is the requirement for 5 days in total, so 5 days total paid sick leave, or 5 days for each occurrence? Can you answer that?
5 days total, although when I've been doing policies, I've really been trying to get away from the days language, because certain employers track days differently. Some people have a 7-hour day, some people have a 9-hour day. I would encourage you to use hours and do 40 or 56 hours as opposed to just saying days.
Okay, great. I'm trying to look for some questions.
Carrie, I saw a couple I can answer.
Oh, good, because a lot of these that I'm looking at are very fact specific. And if they're fact specific, we encourage you to reach out, because it's hard to answer those on the webinar. But yeah, go ahead, Teresa.
We want to, we just can't. So I saw a number of, and I just got a chance to briefly look through the chat. I saw a number of questions about collective bargaining agreements and what you do if you have a collective bargaining agreement that is not up for renegotiation between September 30th and January 1, such that you could negotiate the statutory language about paid sick leave into it prior to when paid sick leave is supposed to become effective. So this is a topic that we've been having internally some discussions about at the firm. We've heard some different things, through New York State and others, that the way New York State is interpreting existing collective bargaining agreements may not require employees to alter them at all. To us, that seems to go directly contradict what the statute says. So if you are an employer in a situation where you have a collective bargaining agreement that doesn't provide for at least as good as benefits as New York State paid sick leave provides for, say you have a collective bargaining agreement that doesn't apply sick leave for per diem employees or something like that, I really do encourage you to reach out to counsel. I think it's important that you understand the risks associated with both modifying that agreement or changing the enforcement of that agreement versus not doing anything with it at all and perhaps waiting on more information from the state. And again, that's a situation we're continuing to monitor here at Bond. If we get anything concrete from New York State, we'll certainly let you know. Right now, it's a bit of conjecture at this point. So just wanted to say that on collective bargaining agreements.
Yep, and I see one here. Is there any clarification for what type of documentation we can request from the employee that's using sick time? And unfortunately, we don't have any clarification on that. Right now, you can't request anything. We were hoping that we would get some guidance that's similar to New York City and some other paid sick leave laws that says if you have an employee that's out for 3 days or more, you can request documentation. But right now we don't have any of that. We're hoping to get some clarification on that from the regulations if regulations end up being issued on this. So hang in there on that one as well.
And then I saw a question, can we front load on a day that's not January 1? Can we front load on an employee's anniversary date or a different day that makes sense for our entity? Yes, you can. Just keep in mind that if you do that, you're just going to need to find a way to bridge the gap between January 1 and whatever that front loading date is. And you can do that different ways. You know, you can either accrue leave in that time, you can prorate leave for that time. But generally speaking, yes, you can use a date that's different than January 1. That's in the statute itself.
Yeah. I'm still looking here. You know, this question here says, if we've allowed carryover of PTO from year to year, are we allowed to continue this? And, you know, the answer to that is yes. I mean, you're allowed to continue carryover. The problem that we've been seeing is that a lot of employers have policies that cap that carryover. So, you know, you may have a PTO policy that says employees can carry over 2 weeks into the next year. And if you want to use that policy to satisfy the paid sick leave obligations, I think you're going to have a little bit of trouble there because currently the carryover has to be unlimited. So, you know, I think we need to be careful about how, I think there's some creative ways to draft those policies to say, you know, we're going to allow carryover from year to year, but cap the use. So, you know, let us know if you need any help with that. But technically, yes, you can have a PTO policy that allows carryover for sure. You just can't cap that carryover if you're using it for paid sick leave purposes.
Yeah, and I saw a question, and Carrie, I'm not as perhaps versed in this as I should be, but pitch in if I get it wrong. The question was, if we have employees that are paid, you know, on a piece rate and not necessarily by hours rate, how do we, you know, track their hours, or what do we use for accrual purposes? You know, say we pay employees by delivery, or we pay employees by the mile. You know, how do we do that? And the guidance, while not being as specific as it could have been, does say that when you have employees who are paid, you know, by commission or something like that, you look at the actual hours they perform doing the work. So if that's not something you're currently tracking, that's something that you need to at least start thinking about tracking. And if you're going to be doing the accrual method, it's something you need to look back and make sure you have tracked since September 30th. So that's how I would answer that one.
You know, I mean, this question says, if you're not tracking PTO used for PSL purposes, how do we know how much to carry over? And I guess the answer to that is, you know, goes along with all this confusion. I mean, you have to carry over, you know, at least the 5 or 7 days that you're giving employees, right? So if you're not tracking for PSL and you're just dumping in or front loading the 40 hours or the 56 hours each year, you have to carry over whatever is left of that time into the subsequent year. And then, you know, theoretically, year after year, you have to allow that carryover on an unlimited basis. You can cap the use at 40 or 56 hours, but you have to allow the carryover. Teresa, do you see one more? We probably have time for one more here.
Yeah, I've been seeing a couple, and one is that I can answer very quickly. Has New York State released a sample policy? No, they have not. Are they going to do that? I don't know. I know they did for sexual harassment. I'm not sure if they will for this. I'd be a little surprised if they were able to for this. Just as someone who goes through policies, I can tell you that they're all pretty differentiated to the individual employer. But, you know, certainly if that's something New York does, we will keep you updated on that. And actually, you know what, Carrie, that does take us to 12:30.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We appreciate it. And as, you know, more developments come up, we'll be sure to get back on here and give you some updates. You know, happy to answer any questions that, you know, we may not have gotten to. You know, feel free to reach out to either Teresa or myself, you know, and let us know. But thank you again. Have a nice afternoon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.